If you could somehow, I don't know, freeze time in the Pacific War, say around May 1942, what you'd see is this naval force that just looked utterly unbeatable.
Yeah, the Imperial Japanese Navy. They were really riding high.
Totally. Riding this massive wave of victory, and it's all symbolized by these four incredible aircraft carriers. Proud, undefeated, feared across the globe.
They weren't just warships, were they?
No, exactly. They were like the
Mhm.
physical proof, right? The undeniable sign of Japan's absolute strategic dominance.
But then, fast forward just 1 month.
Just 1 month later, and in a single day, really just a morning, that whole picture, the pride, the power, it just evaporates.
Smoke, silence, twisted metal, gone.
Sent to the bottom of the ocean. I mean, it has to be one of the most sudden, most complete reversals of fortune in, well, in modern military
It
history.
really is staggering. The fall was so incredibly fast, and the psychological impact was just immense. It basically redefined the entire conflict right then and there.
Yeah. And for the first time, the world saw Japan, which had seemed, unstoppable, facing this undeniable truth that they were vulnerable after all.
Hmm.
And that huge reversal, that's exactly what we're diving into today. Our goal here is to kind of cut through all the historical noise and really understand not just what happened, but how.
Right. How did those four specific carriers, these titans of the fleet, end up lost in just a few hours?
And why did that single event immediately become the turning point of the war in the Pacific? It's like a shortcut to understanding that shift.
And we're talking about the core of the Kido Butai, the first air fleet,
Mm-hmm.
the Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, and the Hiryu.
The Big Four.
The big four. They were the spearhead.
Yeah.
They led the attack on Pearl Harbor. So their destruction, that's really the heart of this story. Their fate basically dictated every major strategic move in the Pacific from that day on.
Okay, so let's unpack this huge shift. We should probably start by looking at just how incredibly confident Japan was right before they decided to make their move on Midway. To really get the scale of the loss, I think you have to appreciate the level of sheer confidence Japan had built up
Oh, absolutely.
after Pearl Harbor and then that sweep across Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. One source described their confidence as knowing no limits. What does that actually look like, that kind of strategic certainty?
Well, it means a couple of things. When a military power gets to that peak, they often stop critically examining their own weaknesses.
Right. You start believing your own hype, maybe.
Kind of, yeah. And you project your success onto your enemy. You start assuming they're demoralized, broken, incapable of any really sophisticated response.
Mm-hmm.
And look, Japan had achieved pretty much exactly what they set out to do those first 6 months. They'd knocked out the immediate American threat. They'd pushed their defensive perimeter way out thousands of miles.
Secured all those resources.
Exactly. Consolidated this huge, resource-rich empire. They had total strategic momentum. It felt unstoppable, I imagine.
And these four specific carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, they were the literal engine of that momentum, weren't they? They weren't just, any old ships.
No, not at all. And Akagi and Kaga, they have an interesting backstory, too.
Right. They weren't originally designed as carriers.
That's right. Akagi started life as a battlecruiser hull. Kaga as a battleship. They were converted. So they were these massive, powerful platforms. A bit slower, maybe, than the purpose-built Soryu and Hiryu, but together, that group of four represented years of Japanese investment and belief in carrier warfare doctrine.
So they're veterans.
That's a really crucial point. These ships, especially Akagi and Kaga, they were veterans. They'd hit Pearl Harbor, they fought in the Indian Ocean raid.
Mm-hmm.
They had dominated pretty much every battle they'd been in.
So their success, this string of one victory after another, it wasn't just validating their strategy.
No, it was creating this deep-seated sense of operational invincibility, among the crews within the high command. They weren't just seen as ships anymore. They were national symbols of this seemingly invincible war machine.
And that perception, that colored how they saw the U.S. Navy, too.
Absolutely. For Japan, the Pacific seemed wide open. That's a quote from a source. They genuinely believed the American forces were, quote, broken, retreating across islands like scattered pieces on a chessboard.
Wow, scattered pieces. That's quite dismissive.
It is. And that psychological dismissal, that's really the first crack, the first seed of their eventual undoing at Midway.
How so?
Well, if you see your enemy as just scattered pieces, you stop being quite so rigorous about your own defensive measures, maybe. You start assuming you have plenty of time to get ready to rearm, to maneuver without serious threat.
Let your guard down.
Essentially, yes. They expected the Americans to be cautious, defensive, just trying to protect what little they had left. They certainly didn't expect an aggressive, preemptive strike aimed right at the heart of their own fleet.
So they thought Midway was just, what, a cleanup operation?
Pretty much. A localized operation to take the atoll, extend their perimeter a bit further.
Yeah.
They weren't preparing for a full-on, peer-level naval battle that would put their most valuable assets, those 4 carriers, directly in harm's way. Hashtag TAC 1.2, the quiet response.
Okay, but that Japanese view, that picture of a broken, retreating U.S. Navy, that wasn't the whole story, was it?
No, not at all. While Japan was celebrating its victories, something very different was happening deep inside the U.S. Navy's command structure.
Our sources talk about a quiet, calculated rage that was building. That sounds different from just, wanting revenge.
It is different. Simple revenge can lead to rash decisions, poorly planned attacks.
Right, lashing out.
Exactly. But calculated rage, that implies something much more disciplined. It's the difference between just hitting back and methodically plotting how to dismantle your enemy's entire system.
Mm-hmm.
After the shock of Pearl Harbor wore off, the U.S. Navy shifted into this almost cold-blooded determination. They knew they couldn't win immediately with brute force. They didn't have it.
They lost too much.
Precisely. So they had to win differently.
Yeah.
Through better planning, through superior intelligence, and ultimately through American industrial resilience.
And this focused energy, this calculated rage, it coalesced around a specific goal: redemption.
Yes. The sources frame the whole counter-effort, really, including everything leading up to Midway and even later actions like Operation Vengeance, as being driven by this powerful need, a need to reverse what was seen as a national humiliation.
So redemption wasn't just about winning one battle.
No, it was much bigger. It was about restoring the fundamental belief, both internally and externally, in American naval power and capability. It kind of elevated the stakes beyond just ships and planes. The plan wasn't just to somehow defeat a seemingly superior force at Midway. It was about using the few assets they did have, primarily the carriers Enterprise, Yorktown, and Hornet, in a way that would deliver crushing, decisive, strategic blow.
To prove they weren't broken.
Exactly. To prove the U.S. Navy wasn't broken and that the surprise attack at Pearl Harbor would ultimately turn out to be Japan's greatest strategic blunder.
So you've got this incredible contrast set up. One side, Japan, driven by this almost blinding overconfidence and imperial ambition. And the other side, the Americans, fueled by this disciplined rage and this deep need for redemption.
And the deciding factor, the thing that would tip the balance between these two powerful forces, wasn't going to be decided by guns or aircraft initially.
Yeah, it was invisible.
Invisible radio waves.
Yeah.
Intelligence, that's absolutely right. The Americans were setting the stage for reckoning.
Yeah.
But the curtain could only go up because of the absolutely incredible work being done hundreds, thousands of miles away from the battlefield, deep in the code-breaking rooms.
Okay, let's get to the battle itself, Midway. The Japanese fleet sails out, fully expecting, as we said, to be hunting down a weakened enemy.
Yeah, that was the plan.
But instead, they were sailing, quote, straight into a trap. And the entire difference between those two scenarios hangs on one thing.
Intelligence.
Pure and simple.
This wasn't luck.
Not even close. This was a planned ambush orchestrated thanks to an unbelievable intelligence coup. The absolutely pivotal moment of the entire Pacific War, arguably, hinges on the fact that American codebreakers managed to achieve what many thought was impossible.
Cracking the main Japanese naval code.
JN 25B, yes, they broke it.
We can't just say they cracked the code, though, right?
Yeah.
For a deep dive, we need to get into what that meant. What specific crucial pieces of information did they get? And maybe just as important, how did they know it was reliable? Okay, great question. The breakthrough allowed Station Hypo in Hawaii, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team. It allowed them to decipher enough of the Japanese naval traffic to figure out the rough timing and, crucially, the target of the next major Japanese operation.
The target was codenamed AF.
Exactly.
Yeah.
AF. Rochefort and his team were pretty damn sure AF meant Midway Atoll, but pretty sure isn't good enough when you're about to risk your entire remaining Pacific fleet.
Right, you need certainty.
They needed absolute confirmation. And this is where they pulled off this simple but utterly brilliant bit of counterintelligence. A clever ruse.
Ah, the water story.
The water story, exactly. They had the U.S. garrison at Midway send out a radio message in the clear, deliberately unencrypted, saying that their freshwater distillation plant had broken down and they were running critically low on water.
Knowing the Japanese would intercept it.
Precisely. And sure enough, just a short time later, American listening posts picked up a coded Japanese transmission relaying the intel back to their main fleet. And the message essentially said, AF is short of water.
Bingo. Confirmation. That is just one of the most amazing little stories in military intelligence history.
It really is. It's genius in its simplicity. So using that manufactured emergency, they turned AF from a suspected target into a confirmed geographical location, Midway.
And knowing that gave them this incredible advantage. They knew exactly where the Japanese were going to strike.
And critically, they knew when, roughly, and they knew the composition of the force. They knew Nagumo's 4 main carriers were coming.
Which let Admiral Nimitz make his move.
Exactly. Nimitz could now confidently deploy his available carriers, Enterprise, Yorktown, which was hastily repaired after the Coral Sea, and Hornet to a position northeast of Midway, waiting, completely undetected.
So the Americans didn't have to go searching. They weren't reacting.
No, they could just wait. Wait for the enemy to sail right into their sights.
Yes.
They completely dictated the terms of engagement, and crucially, they held the element of strategic surprise.
Yeah.
It's like Pearl Harbor in reverse.
It's just the ultimate example of how good intelligence can turn a defensive situation into a decisive offensive victory.
While the Japanese high command, blinded by their own success and lack of good intel, just sailed obliviously into the jaws of a trap they never even suspected was there. Hashtag 2.2 A Chaos in the Clouds, June 4th, 1942.
So, June 4th, 1942. Dawn breaks, the waiting is over, the 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Yorktown, Hornet, they launch their strike groups.
Yep, the planes are in the air.
And the Japanese fleet, despite its size, its power, its veteran status, it gets caught totally off guard. And worse, caught at perhaps the single most vulnerable moment possible for an aircraft carrier fleet.
That vulnerability, that's the absolute key to understanding why the damage was so swift, so catastrophic, so complete.
Explain that. Why were they so vulnerable right then?
Okay, so at that exact moment, the 4 Japanese carriers were in this state of, well, controlled chaos, really. They had already launched their first strike against Midway Island itself.
Right, bombing the facilities there.
Yes. And those planes were starting to return, low on fuel, needing rearming. But at the same time, the Japanese command, Admiral Nagumo, received scouting reports. Reports indicating American ships were nearby, possibly carriers.
Which changes everything.
Completely changes the priority. Now they needed to prepare a strike against enemy ships, not land targets. This meant a frantic change in ordnance.
Switching the bombs and torpedoes. That decision right there, that seems to be where it all goes wrong.
It sealed their fate, absolutely. The planes that had just bombed Midway needed to be rearmed for naval attack. That means taking off the high-explosive land bombs.
And putting on armor-piercing bombs or, crucially, torpedoes for ship attacks.
Exactly. And in the rush to do this, procedures got sloppy. Safety protocols were ignored. Highly explosive munitions, bombs, torpedoes along with fuel hoses snaking across the decks and aircraft fully loaded with gasoline. They were all just stacked up, crowding the hangar decks and even parts of the flight decks. They were waiting for the elevators, waiting for the rearming crews.
Speed over safety.
Speed over safety. Damage control readiness was basically non-existent in that moment. They were focused entirely on getting the next strike launched as fast as possible.
So the carriers were essentially floating powder kegs even before the first American plane showed up.
That's a perfect description, floating powder kegs. And then the American dive bombers, primarily from Enterprise and the miraculously repaired Yorktown, they found them. They screamed from the sky, as the source puts it.
And the timing was just perfect, or perfectly awful for the Japanese.
Horrifyingly perfect for the Americans. The Japanese carriers were maneuvering, trying to recover their Midway strike planes, trying to launch their combat air patrol fighters. But the dauntless dive bombers broke through. They found their targets below.
And the sequence of destruction was just brutal, wasn't it?
Unbelievably brutal and fast. When those first American bombs hit, we're talking 500-pound, 1,000-pound bombs, they easily punched through the relatively thin, unarmored flight deck.
And exploded down below.
Right down into those packed hangar bays. The bays filled with fuel, bombs, torpedoes, planes, everything needed for a catastrophic fire.
So the chain reaction was instantaneous.
Instantaneous and irreversible.
Yeah.
The bombs didn't just cause damage, they acted like giant detonators. They ignited the huge quantities of aviation fuel, they set off the stored ammunition, they turned the fully armed aircraft waiting on the decks into secondary explosions.
Just turning the ships into these massive, self-consuming infernos within minutes.
Minutes. You look at the accounts for ships like Kaga and Akagi especially, the concentration of hits, the sheer ferocity of the fires, they raged completely out of control almost immediately. Water mains ruptured, elevators jammed, trapping firefighting crews below decks, or preventing equipment from reaching the flight deck.
Any hope of saving them just vanished.
Completely gone. Yeah. The heat, the secondary explosions, it made any meaningful damage control utterly impossible. Within just a few hours, 3 of the 4 Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were crippled beyond saving, dead in the water, and sinking or about to be scuttled.
And Hiryu, the fourth one, she managed to strike back, didn't she? She found and fatally damaged the Yorktown.
She did. A brief, valiant counterpunch. But it was too little, too late. Her position was known, and the American carriers launched a final strike that found Hiryu later that day and sealed her fate as well.
Just sunk like the others.
Sunk like the others. And the ultimate profound irony here, which our sources really drive home, is that these 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, the very same ships that had launched the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor,
And symbolized Japan's seemingly unstoppable air power.
were now themselves consumed by the exact same kind of fire and destruction they had unleashed just 6 months earlier. It's like history just slammed a door shut right there. A bloody, decisive loop closed. Hashtag tag 2.3, the immediate catastrophe.
Okay, let's try to quantify the immediate impact. The loss was obviously catastrophic. We focus a lot on the ships, the steel, but the human cost right there on that day was immense.
It was staggering. Over 3,000 Japanese sailors and airmen perished with those 4 carriers.
3,000 lives.
And that number, 3,000, it's stark.
Yeah.
But the qualitative loss, who those men were, that's what truly crippled the Japanese war effort moving forward.
What do you mean by a qualitative loss?
Well, the casualties weren't evenly distributed. They included a disproportionately high number of highly experienced flight deck crews, essential aircraft maintenance specialists, and this is absolutely crucial, the elite, pre-war trained veteran carrier pilots.
The best of the best.
The absolute best. You can eventually build a new steel hull for a carrier. It takes time, resources, but it's possible. What you cannot easily replace is a veteran carrier pilot with thousands of hours of flight time, years of specialized training, and the incredibly complex art of launching from and landing on a moving deck at sea, often in combat conditions.
That experience is irreplaceable, especially quickly.
Exactly, and that leads right into the core analysis point. Japan's naval air power, described as its strongest weapon, was, quote, crippled forever.
Why forever? That sounds so final. Couldn't they just build more carriers, train more pilots, mobilize their industry?
This is where the stark reality of wartime economics comes crashing in. You have to compare the industrial capacities of Japan and the United States in 1942.
And they weren't even close.
Not even in the same league. Japan's industrial base, while capable, was finite. It was already stretched incredibly thin, supporting its vast new empire and its army in China. The U.S., on the other hand, was just beginning to awaken its colossal industrial might, the arsenal of democracy.
So Japan couldn't replace the lost carriers quickly enough.
They simply couldn't build new fleet carrier ships like the later Taiho or the converted Shinano anywhere near fast enough to make up for the loss of those 4 veteran ships and regain parity with the growing U.S. fleet. From Midway onwards, they were always playing catch-up in their production rates. They had absolutely no chance of winning.
And the pilot problem just made it worse.
Compounded it massively.
Yeah.
The Japanese pilot training system before the war was incredibly rigorous, focused on producing a small number of elite superpilots. It was slow, meticulous, emphasizing quality over quantity.
Which worked fine until they lost a huge chunk of them at once.
Exactly. Once those veteran air groups from Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu were wiped out at Midway, Japan had no mechanism in place to rapidly train high-quality replacements in large numbers.
So the quality dropped.
It had to. They were forced to shorten the training courses, lower the standards, just to get bodies into cockpits. The quality of their replacement pilots inevitably declined, and declined rapidly throughout the rest of the war.
Whereas the Americans...
The Americans had a much larger pool of potential recruits to draw from, and crucially, they developed a highly efficient, high-volume flight training system. They could absorb their losses, and they took heavy pilot losses too, let's be clear. But they could churn out new, competent aviators much, much faster than the Japanese could. Faster even than their new carriers were sliding down the slipways.
So the strategic blow of Midway wasn't just losing 4 hulls.
No, it was the simultaneous decapitation of their veteran naval air force and the brutal, unavoidable realization that their industrial economy simply could not compete with American output in a long war.
It fundamentally reset the entire naval balance in the Pacific.
Instantly. Permanently. Before Midway, the Allies were scrambling, desperate. After Midway, Japan was on the defensive, desperate. The strategic initiative, the ability to dictate the course of the war, it shifted right there on June 4th, 1942, and it never shifted back. Japan was forced into a defensive posture from that moment on.
But that narrative we talked about, the American need for redemption, it wasn't entirely satisfied just by winning at Midway, was it?
No, not quite. There was still a sense of unfinished business, a desire for direct retribution against the man seen as the architect of the initial aggression.
Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto.
Yamamoto, exactly. Months after Midway, in early 1943, American intelligence intercepts pinpointed his location and travel plans.
And he was the big symbolic target, wasn't he?
Absolutely. As Commander-in-Chief of Japan's combined fleet, he was seen, rightly or wrongly, as the primary driving force, the strategic mind behind the Pearl Harbor attack, and Japan's whole expansionist doctrine. So targeting him personally became sort of the psychological capstone to the Midway victory.
Our sources call him the mastermind of Pearl Harbor. So when intelligence found out he was going to be flying near Bougainville in the Solomon Islands,
The opportunity was seen as too significant to pass up. It was viewed as critical, not just militarily, but symbolically.
and this led to the mission codenamed Operation Vengeance. The goal sounds simple, but executing it must have been incredibly complex.
Oh, extremely. The stated goal was clear. Intercept his plane and bring justice for Pearl Harbor. But the how was the challenge.
Why was it so difficult?
The range. Yamamoto's flight path was deep, deep within enemy-controlled territory. Hundreds of miles from the nearest Allied air base capable of launching fighters that could reach him.
So they needed long-range fighters.
They needed the P-38 Lightning. Its twin engines and design gave it the necessary range. But even then, it was an incredibly long mission, over 400 miles just to get to the intercept point. It required absolute perfection in navigation, timing down to the minute, and careful fuel
A
management.
huge risk.
A massive risk. Flying that far over enemy territory, hoping to hit a precise point in the sky at a precise moment. It shows just how badly the American High Command wanted to close that symbolic circle, the one that started at Pearl Harbor, hashtag 3.2, the execution of retaliation, April 18th, 1943.
Okay, let's talk about the mission itself. April 18th, 1943. Operation Vengeance goes ahead. American P-38 pilots fly deep behind enemy lines.
It was an incredibly demanding flight profile. Meticulous planning, synchronization between the killer flight and the top cover, total radio silence to avoid tipping off the Japanese.
And they had to fly low, right, to avoid radar.
Very low. Skimming the waves, then over the jungle canopy as they got closer, maintaining extreme flight discipline for hours. The whole plan relied on the accuracy of the intercepted Japanese itinerary for Yamamoto's flight.
Yeah.
I had to trust the codebreakers' work implicitly.
And that precision, that trust, it paid off.
It did. Against incredible odds, they arrived at the calculated intercept point at almost the exact right moment. They spotted Yamamoto's transport bomber, escorted by 0 fighters.
And they took him down.
A short, sharp aerial engagement. The P-38s targeted the bombers specifically. They caught Yamamoto's aircraft in sight, hit it with a devastating burst of gunfire, and sent it crashing into the jungle below.
Fulfilling that promise of retribution.
For the American military, and certainly for the American public back home, the success of Operation Vengeance felt like a symbolic end. It provided a sense of closure for Pearl Harbor. The architect, the mastermind, had been brought down.
But beyond the symbolism, what was the strategic impact on Japan? Losing Yamamoto, especially coming less than a year after the Midway disaster.
It was enormous. It constituted another devastating blow for Japan, absolutely. Losing their most famous and arguably most capable naval strategist right after losing the core of their carrier striking power. It was a double hammer blow.
What did that signal both to Japan itself and to the world?
It clearly signaled that Japan's era of dominance was well and truly fading fast. It demonstrated the reach and the terrifying effectiveness of American intelligence and long-range air power.
Must have hit morale hard.
Devastating for morale, especially at the higher levels of command. They'd lost the fleet that was supposed to win the war at Midway. Now they'd lost the strategist who was supposed to guide them. It deepened the crisis of confidence, confirming for everyone that the strategic initiative now belonged entirely to the United States.
We've talked about the tactics, the strategy, the immediate losses, but our sources really emphasize something deeper. That the loss of those 4 carriers at Midway didn't just change the course of the Pacific War, it changed Japan itself. That sounds like a fundamental psychological shock.
I think it was. You have to understand, Japan's modern identity, especially since the Meiji Restoration, was deeply intertwined with its military prowess, with this belief in its imperial destiny, its spiritual superiority almost.
An unbroken string of victories,
Pretty
really.
much, yeah.
Yeah.
So to suddenly realize that their best forces, the pride of the Navy, could be so decisively, so swiftly crushed in a single battle, it just shattered the illusion of invincibility. That's a key phrase.
Before Midway, failure wasn't really conceivable.
Not on that scale, not the core fleet being wiped out like that. After Midway, the whole mindset had to shift. Victory was no longer the assumed outcome. Protracted, bloody survival became the only realistic, achievable goal.
And looking back at that seemingly invincible military machine, the one that had swept across the Pacific, suddenly they had to face a truth about their enemy, the U.S., that maybe they'd ignored or underestimated.
Definitely. The inescapable truth was the American capacity for rapid, highly organized, technologically sophisticated retaliation, backed, crucially, by an industrial base that could absorb losses and keep coming, and powered by an intelligence apparatus that, in this case, proved far superior.
It wasn't something they'd fully accounted for in their planning.
No. And the universal lesson there, the one that echoes down through history and is still relevant today, is that no empire, no matter how powerful, can stand forever against strategy, intelligence, and resilience.
Raw power isn't enough.
Raw military power, especially if it breeds overconfidence, is ultimately fragile if it's not supported by better information, adaptability, and the resources to sustain the fight.
Midway is just the ultimate case study for that, isn't it? The Americans used what they had fewer ships, remember, far more effectively than the Japanese used their larger fleet.
Primarily because of that intelligence edge from the code breaking. It proves, maybe more clearly than any other single battle, that operational knowledge, knowing what your enemy is going to do, can decisively overcome material superiority.
So the illusion shattered wasn't just about losing ships.
No, it was the realization that the decisive factor wasn't the strength of their swords or the spirit of their warriors, but the quality of the information flowing into Nimitz's command center in Hawaii, combined with the unstoppable industrial engine warming up back in the States. That's a hard truth to face. Hashtag Chev 4.2, the turning point.
Which brings us right back to why historians, pretty much universally, still call the Battle of Midway the turning point of the Pacific. Why that specific label?
Because it marks the point of irreversible change. It's the high water mark of Japanese expansion. Before Midway, Japan held the strategic initiative. They decided where and when the major battles would be fought. They were on the offensive.
After Midway.
After Midway, they never regained that initiative. Not really. The strategic momentum shifted permanently to the Allies. The fundamental question of the war changed overnight. It went from how much further can Japan conquer to how long can Japan possibly hold out against the inevitable counteroffensive.
And let's dig into that shift in Japan's objective. Our source really highlights this. From Midway on, Japan fought not for victory, but for survival.
Yo.
What does that actually mean in practical terms for their strategy, for the soldiers fighting?
It means a total shift in military philosophy. You move away from offensive campaigns aimed at capturing territory, securing resources, achieving glorious victory,
And you move towards what?
towards grinding, defensive attrition warfare. Fighting for survival means digging in, holding on to the islands you've already taken, accepting horrific casualty rates to make the enemy pay dearly for every inch of ground. Think about the brutal island campaigns that followed Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. That's the face of fighting for survival.
So the goal wasn't conquest anymore. It was just bleed the enemy, hope they lose the will to keep fighting.
Essentially, yes, inflict enough pain, enough casualties on the Americans that maybe, just maybe, the U.S. public would tire of the war and force their government to negotiate some kind of peace settlement that left Japan with at least some of its gains intact.
Playing for a draw, basically.
Playing for a draw they couldn't possibly win against the overwhelming industrial and military might the U.S. was bringing to bear. It was a tragic, desperate strategy born directly from the catastrophe at Midway.
Because that shift from offense to defense meant Japan was always reacting, right? Always on the back foot.
Always reacting, always trying to plug the gaps against an American drive that was just relentless, fueled by seemingly inexhaustible production capacity. The resources Japan lost at Midway, those 4 carriers, those veteran air crews, they were simply irreplaceable in the time they had left.
So while Midway wasn't the end of the war by any means,
Not even close. 3 more years of incredibly bloody fighting lay ahead.
but it was the moment, as the source beautifully puts it, when the tide turned and destiny itself seemed to just shift across the ocean waves. It set the brutal course for the rest of the Pacific War. It changed the very nature of the fight for everyone involved. Hashtag tag outro.
So our deep dive today into that shocking loss, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, it really shows us, I think, a critical moment where speed, incredible intelligence work, and a kind of disciplined resilience managed to overcome what looked like unassailable supremacy just 6 months after Pearl Harbor. Yeah, what really stands out is just how fast the foundations of that perceived power could crumble. When faced with a smart, coordinated, intelligence-driven attack, it took Japan years to build that seemingly invincible naval air corps,
Hmm.
but it only took a few critical hours, really just one morning of focused combat driven by that code-breaking edge to bring it all crashing down. It's just the definitive proof, isn't it, of the power of preparation and knowledge over sheer presumption and force.
Before we wrap up, we talked a lot about that idea. After Midway, Japan fought for survival, not for victory. And that leaves us with a really difficult, but I think profound question for you, the listener, to think about.
Okay.
If the absolute pinnacle of your nation's military power, in this case, its undefeated core carrier fleet, is just wiped out, essentially, in a single day, how quickly does that military high command, that whole national mindset, have to pivot?
Yeah.
How fast do they shift from an offensive doctrine focused on glory and expansion to a purely defensive, prolonged resistance driven only by desperation?
And maybe think about the human cost of that shift, too. What does it mean for the soldiers, the sailors, the airmen on the front lines when the objective changes? When it's no longer about conquering the next island, but just surviving the next bombardment, the next assault? That willingness to sacrifice, the very definition of success, it changes completely, doesn't it?
It becomes agonizingly small.
Exactly. And that transition from the dream of victory to the grim reality of mere survival, that really defined the final brutal years of the Pacific War
Right.
for every single person caught up in it.